they're using the $10 million vocabulary that nobody speaks.
Hello and welcome to episode 30 of the Who Cares Anyway podcast. My guest is Alan Bishop, best known for his role in Sun City Girls, but also Sublime Frequencies, his various alter egos, including Uncle Jim and Alvarius B., the latter of whom has a new album coming out, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But as for this interview, it actually comes from the archives way back in 2016 when I interviewed him for the book, Who Cares Anyway. There weren't a whole lot of people I interviewed who never lived in San Francisco. He was one of them, largely because of how intertwined Sun City Girls had been with whether it's Carolina or different Gregg Turkington projects or later the Thinking Fellers. There's just a lot of intertwining history, and so this was sort of a chance to get the view of San Francisco from outside while also getting a sort of alternative history of Sun City Girls vis-a-vis San Francisco, if I may use that expression. During the interview, I was referring to the concert history page on suncitygirls.com, which helpfully lists all of their concerts, including the ones that they played in San Francisco at different points in the 80s and early 90s. And so that was sort of the timeline that I was following throughout. Now, I mentioned earlier, Alvarius B. There is a new album coming out entitled Malarial Dream, and that is going to be on the Abduction label, release date May 1st. It's already up on Bandcamp, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. But you'll be hearing some snippets from that throughout this interview in the various segues that I use to get from one segment of the interview to another. And so you might say, well, that's a little bit incongruous. We're talking about Sun City Girls in San Francisco, an interview that was done in 2016 talking about the 80s and 90s. Here he is in Egypt making a new album that's coming out in 2026. And then on top of that, the cover art for this episode comes from one of the Sun City Girls Carnival Folklore Resurrection CDs from the early 2000s, Sumatran Electric Chair. And so kind of all over the place, but it all has to do with Alan Bishop, Sun City Girls, etc. He is just somebody who I always find interesting, especially when he gets a little bit of room to open up. And so we get a little bit of that toward the end. A fair bit of this was quoted in the book, but probably more of it wasn't quoted. And so whether you've had a chance to read the book or not, if you're a fan of Alan Bishop and Sun City Girls, I think you'll find this interesting. And so without further ado, I'll step aside and let us get into the interview with Alan Bishop.
Actually met Grux, but I think it was somewhere in the vicinity of 1982 or 83. I had this confusion about meeting, I think I met Greg and Gwen, his sister, in Phoenix. We were playing on the street in front of the post office in Tempe, and I met Greg and Gwen, and I think somebody else who I always thought might have been Grux visiting or something, but I think that's wrong. Came up and watched us perform, and then they said hello or whatever. And then the next night, I was at the theater across the street, the Valley Art Cinema, watching a film. I don't even remember which film it was. And I heard these people talking about us performing on the sidewalk the day before, and I turned around and it was them. It was the same. It was Greg and Gwen. And I always thought that Grux met me there too, but I think that's incorrect, and I think I probably met him either through the mail. He either contacted us through the mail, or I met him in San Francisco in 1983. And I really don't remember the first encounter. I can't even remember. I just remember so many other ones. Over the years, he came to Phoenix with his ambulance, and we'd go to San Francisco and perform with them or see him every time. And there was always a new version of Carolina to see, and then that went on for years. So... But it would have been the early 80s, 82, 83, somewhere in there.
how well did you know Gregg down in Phoenix? Because I guess he moved up there to San Francisco in like '83.
Yeah, not well. I mean, I just ran into him that one time, or those two times, and then maybe I saw him again at a show, but I don't really remember him because he did move early, and perhaps I'm not sure if he stayed, I would have gotten to know him, but then I knew him from the Bay Area, and I was corresponding with him shortly thereafter, and he had that band Hello Kitty on Ice, and then after that, I can't remember when he started doing Breakfast Without Meat, but that showed up at some point. I think that was a little later, but yeah, I mean, Gregg and Grux were always people that we would visit or see some in one capacity or another when we were in the Bay Area.
Right. Yeah, because Gregg mentioned seeing that show that would have been. I'm looking at the tour dates or the show dates now. Flipper Meat Puppets, March 1983.
Yeah, he was at that show. Yeah, I know. He talks about that show a lot too.
That's a pretty legendary bill, though.
Yeah, it's a great night. Yeah, we did a completely fucked set. We, from what I can remember, it was a short set, maybe 30 minutes, and I think we were just doing this theatrical kind of performance, doing weird spoken word and screaming, and I think then Rick would launch into the Johnny Quest theme on guitar, and I don't know, we did something about the Wizard of Oz, and I was playing the Wicked Witch, and I don't know, Charlie did a drum solo. You know, it was one of those sets to where anything can kind of happen, and there was no plan. And I just remember the Meat Puppets coming up afterwards and just, you know, freaking out about it, loving it. I didn't meet Gregg then, though. I didn't see him at that show, but I know he was there. And then we talked to Flipper after the show and hung out with Will and we, you know, after seeing them perform, which was a great show, by the way. I'd seen the Meat Puppets many times, and I really, really loved their shows in those days, 81, 82, 83, these shows before the Meat Puppets 2 came out, pretty much. But I still liked them. It's just the band became a lot more tame than they were. I mean, they were so uncontrollable. It was great. But yeah, it was the first time I saw Flipper, and Will was very friendly, and I think he wrote Charlie later. You know, him and Charlie were hanging out drinking in the back somewhere, and I think he wrote him and kept in touch with Charlie because Charlie gave him his address, and back then everything was done by mail, or by phone, of course.
Yeah, is it true that he said something about wanting to join the band? Did you ever hear that?
I never heard that. I read what you wrote, what Gregg said about that, and maybe it was true. Maybe he wrote it to Charlie, and I've got it sitting around in a letter somewhere, or maybe he told him. I mean, he may have said it. I just don't know. I don't remember.
That could have been more trouble than.
Yeah, I don't know how it would have worked, or if it would have. I mean, we weren't moving to the Bay Area by then, you know, at that point, and I don't think he was coming down to Phoenix. So I think it was just maybe just some kind of an idea. But he was a very interesting character, and who knows, you know.
So, and I'm looking at here. So the first time you all played up in San Francisco was in '84 at the. Looks like it was on Broadway.
Yeah, I think that was the first gig the girls played, and I think I was probably playing with JFA on the same bill.
Yeah.
We had gone to San Francisco before then, though. I had been up there a couple of times in 1981, and then in 1983. I think it was New Year's between 82 and 83, or was it 83 and 84? We were up there for 2 weeks with a bus. Tony Victor was going to a bunch of Grateful Dead shows. It was Charlie and I, we brought Eddie Detroit. We just hijacked Eddie Detroit, threw him in the bus, and he was coming with us with the Barron brothers, Tony and his other brothers, and Wayno and some other characters that were Greg Hines, of course, from the Mighty Sphincter, also co-owner of Placebo at the time. And most of those guys were interested in going to the Dead shows, and we just tagged along to get a free ride to San Francisco, and there were 2 hotel rooms that we rented out at the Travel Lodge downtown, and I think we put maybe 15 people in each room. I don't know how they put up with us. It was, you know, you couldn't get away with that shit today. We parked the bus right out front. It was fucked up. Everyone was high all the time. Yeah, that was a crazy, crazy experience.
How long was that bus trip?
Well, I think, if you can drive it in 24 hours or less, but I think we probably did both ways. We just drove straight through. We did that drive many, many times by car, and if you just want to, you can just do it until you get there. It's I think it's 6 hours to LA, and then what is it, driving 8 hours to San Francisco, 6 hours to San Francisco?
I think you can do that in about
14 hours, something like that. You can easily do it.
Touring then, what stops would there be in between Phoenix and San Francisco? Would it be basically LA and maybe somewhere in between?
Or Vegas. I think we did both, but sometimes we go straight to San Francisco, come back down, do LA on the way back, or we do Vegas on the way up, and then San Francisco, then LA. Sometimes we just go to San Francisco and drive back. So, and then there were a few occasions where the tours would take us up to Portland or Seattle or Olympia or something like this on the West Coast swing. And we did Vancouver occasionally on those too, but that was later. There was Sacramento once in there somewhere, I think. But yeah, it was just really LA and San Francisco were the dependable markets, that would book a show. And then, there were plenty of trips just to LA, but we'd always prefer going to San Francisco because we found it much more interesting there. And the music was more interesting, the musicians, the people. And we had better shows there. We had better attendance there. It was a good city for us. We had more people in San Francisco than we could get anywhere else.
Yeah, I'm looking at so the first places you played were up in still like the on Broadway and the Mabuhay.
Played there. We played Covered Wagon. We played this other place with Hello Kitty on Ice. That might have been one of the earliest shows we did, and I can't remember the name of the place, where Helios Creed was standing on a chair by the door during the entire show.
It was Club Foot.
Club Foot, yeah, it was Club Foot.
Yeah, that's that totally different part of town. That's actually near that Warepad place where I think.
Right. Yeah, Warepad. Yeah.
That. Yeah. So I mean, what I don't know. How would you describe the difference between? Because I don't know really anything about what Phoenix was like other than just some of the bands, but Phoenix versus San Francisco. Was there much?
Well, San Francisco for us had mythical status, as younger people. When we were first going up there in the early '80s, we're just, less 15 years removed from the Summer of Love. It wasn't that long, and so obviously we knew all about the '60s and '70s things happening in San Francisco, and the punk scene or the more experimental scene that developed in the early 80s was an extension of that to us at the time. And, the place was still, we go back to the Beat generation. We'd always, look at San Francisco as this kind of refuge of like-minded, thinkers or people, artists. And so that's what we tried to, the more you believe in something, the more you make something that you believe in more like what you believe in. So it became, a mecca for us to, it was always something we looked forward to going to San Francisco, not just to, and a lot of the artists and younger musician friends of ours that were there at the time, maybe, for them, they weren't as interested in the Beat generation, or they weren't as interested in 60s music. They were throwing all that out the window, but we had an interest in everything, all the time, everything. So it was all a part of what we were thinking. So, we had traits of, psychedelic music and jazz and bebop and free jazz in our repertoire, along with complete noise and experimental music and music concreta. And we were doing all that stuff somehow in our weird blender, our formula, and that didn't always resonate, but up there it seemed to really, we could really always get a good audience and a very responsive audience, and we had a lot of great shows there.
Yeah.
And for us, there was no comparison to Phoenix. Phoenix was hot, it was flat, boring, dull, super conservative. San Francisco was much more free. It was much more temperate. It had it was a beautiful city, older city. I mean, there was no comparison for us.
Was the stuff coming out of San Francisco in the late 70s, early 80s, did much of that reach Phoenix, whether it was the residents or research or subterranean?
Well, it reached us. I think people who were interested in that stuff were looking for it and could find it. All of that reached us, but I think there was a decent network of record stores that would carry not only the records by these bands from out of town, they would order the publications like Research or Search and Destroy, or these kind of of course the skate, Maximum Rock and Roll, the skate scene, all that stuff would be Flipside, Thrasher, all of that stuff would be dealt with and be available. So if you're looking for it and your radar was receiving it, then you're going to find it. You could always do mail order if you knew where to look that way as well. So yeah, it was reaching. But I mean, we had a couple of radio stations over the years in Phoenix that would play. There was a station called K15 that I think was only on the air for less than a year, but in a critical time between 80 and 81, I think. And they would play a lot of this music. They would play stuff from the UK though, and XTC was played on there a lot. The Police, things like this. But they would throw on, some really more obscure stuff, like DFX2 and just weird shit that you would never know about if you didn't listen to K15. And these bands were able to tour Phoenix because of it. So. And then there was some college radio as well. But, I mean, that combined with the record stores, which were the meccas really for everyone, the right kind of, we had a couple of stores that were, Roads to Moscow was a record store in Tempe that would have all of this stuff available, and to a lesser extent, a few other shops would carry some stuff. But this is where you had to go, and then you would go to shows, and you would buy albums from touring bands, and then you would hear stories, and you would read some of the magazines, and it's just everyone was pretty hungry for information.
In terms of the hardcore stuff, so that I'm looking at that first bill, Fang. Obviously, you were playing with JFA, and then within a couple of years, it was a totally different thing. You're playing at Club Foot.
The show with Mighty Sphincter and Sun City Girls as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's at the On Broadway, which at that time I think was one of the. I mean, that would have Black Flag, and that would have Crucifix and all kinds of
the Misfits. I mean, anyone could show up there, in that normal touring circuit back then.
Yeah, and then within a couple of years, I think it was sort of what you mentioned earlier, that like by '86, that had sort of forked off in the sense that you either went one way or the other. But it seemed like by that point there was something else that didn't really exist. Carolina or Sun City Girls, maybe a few other things, but. Was it a matter of coming together just because you all saw something in common in each other, or just that there was nowhere else to go, or you had to make your own?
I think it was a combination of that. I mean, we were friends, so this was something that you do when you tour around the States anyway. You try to line up shows with your friends' bands that you may stay with them, so you do a gig with them, you split the money with them, you hope that, our friends are probably going to be doing something somewhat interesting. We weren't going to, if we had other friends there that didn't do music, that's different. But, it was a like-minded community, I think. But it was a small crowd of people who would be accepting, more experimental music at the time, that's for sure. But we would sometimes have to play with punk bands or play with whatever, even later, I mean, it just depends. But it did become much more sectarian later, and the odds of us playing with a punk band in 1986 and beyond it hardly ever happened. So became more sectarian, and we would not want anything to do with these hardcore shows. It just wasn't our crowd. We didn't really have any interest in it. We didn't really like much of the music at all, and they weren't going to like us. So, I mean, it was a confrontational thing up until when it kind of branched off, because up until maybe I'd say 84 or 85, that's around the time to where it really got confrontational in 84 on the JFA Sun City Girl Tour. No matter where we went, JFA was doing one thing that was pleasing the audience that was showing up. They were the draw. Yet the Sun City Girls were doing a completely other. We had a whole other operating system, which pissed off so many kids that didn't understand it, and then it would become confrontational and violent at times. So, and then I'm going off stage, taking off my Sun City Girl outfit, and just looking like the JFA guys, and going out there playing JFA songs, and they didn't even know it was me. So, but they loved it. It was that kind of a dichotomy. But this was common in those days in terms of bands that were willing to experiment than there were maybe 81, 82, 83.
You're in that first issue of Banana Fish, and was that an anomaly in terms of people from other places, in terms of people noticing you all or writing about you all at that point?
Well, that was one place where they were interested in us, and yeah, we were interviewed in that. I think, yeah, and of course, probably Breakfast Without Meat. I don't know, but there were other regional magazines. It just depends on the year. We got more local press before we did a national tour, and the Phoenix New Times, or maybe even I think we were even written up once a couple times in the Arizona Republic. In fact, the way we got our name is a really interesting story. We were changing our name every night. It was after we were called. Actually, this was. No, I don't want to tell that story because I might get it wrong, but I don't want to get off the topic here either. But we can revisit that in a second, because now I'm thinking I'm going to say the wrong thing here in terms of a timeline. But there were other magazines once we toured around, like when we did that 84 tour with JFA. We'd get interviewed in a lot of different places around the country. So then we were featured in all these different local, whether they were fanzines, whether they were weeklies or whatever, and many we never probably even saw, but we did get some of them. I was pretty active trying to keep the archive, up to date. That was kind of what I always did, and there's a lot of one-off fanzines that never showed up again, and I have boxes of this stuff, but I mean, it was a time where you had. I'm trying to think of that other magazine. Option was around in the early to mid 80s. That may have covered us. There was JFA was all over Flipside, and Maximum Rock and Roll, of course. They covered both bands. They covered JFA and Sun City Girls. They would review Sun City Girls records.
Really? I never seen.
Yeah. There's a couple of reviews in Maximum Rock and Rolls. And they have those review sections, which are like,
oh yeah,
it's like communist reviews. They're all the same, they all look the same, and nothing stands out. It's just like these little narrow boxes of one record after the next.
Were they generally? I don't know. How did they react? I mean,
no, they were positive. I think Tim Yohannan really liked us, and wrote us up well. I think he did both of the reviews. And, Forced Exposure came later, magazines like that. But I remember that there was some magazine from Bordeaux, France called Hello Happy Taxpayer that wrote us in 1985 and did a feature on us in French, and they mailed it to me, which was amazing. That was a big deal to us at the time. we'd get letters from John Peel, wanting us to send him. I think by the time Grotto of Miracles came out, he wanted our first 2 albums. It wasn't much. I mean, we were really off the radar until Torch of the Mystics for the most part, and Byron Coley writing us up in Spin. But also there was another review. I think it was Ann Magnuson did a review of our first album in Spin as well, but it came out late. It came out in like 2 or 3 years after it came out, or maybe a year and a half, 85, 86, whenever it was. There was a review in Spin of our first album, a really positive review.
See, that's hard to imagine. Yeah,
it was really, really, sparse attention. So I'm sure radio airplay was around. Whoever had the records could get the records, would put them on their, small independent radio stations. But everything was by mail, and we would have to be notified by someone sending us a letter or a playlist or an article that we had actually done. I mean, there were a few phone interviews that happened back then, but it was very sparse, and everything was so regionalized and localized that, most of our press was local, Phoenix and Tucson.
Yeah, and you all were doing you were doing tapes at the same time, and were those totally self-released?
Yeah, they were totally self-released. We were doing, first we were trading tapes with our friends, and that's how I really got to know Grux and Gregg really well, is because we traded tapes on a monthly basis. I would send things to them, they'd send things back. And I had other friends like that around the country. Bob Moore, Scott Colburn was doing that from Chicago or Indiana or wherever he was at the time. Many others. There was a girl, Cammie, from Friend of the Butthole Surfers in San Antonio, that would just send me all their stuff. And they sent me that Thai shotgun tape, that cassette they got that they used on that record with that Thai.
Oh, yeah.
Thai Luke Tung, what I know is a Luke Tung song now with the Cunt song.
Yeah.
I had that before they even released it. She sent that to me. I mean, stuff was passing around. Daniel Johnson, she'd send me all the Daniel Johnson cassettes. And, it's just, this was going on with all your friends. Everybody did it, I mean, it just I guess because we were all musicians in the musician network of doing it, that it has maybe more significance. But everybody else, in terms of folklore anyway at this point, but everybody else who was interested in music was doing the same fucking thing. Whether they were into Black Sabbath or they were into punk rock, or experimental music or free jazz, everyone was doing the same thing. That's the way you spread music back then. You either buy records or listen to records or send them around, or you make tapes.
Yeah. Were any of was the tape reviewing zines like Op or whatever, was that stuff even or useful, or was that like, did anybody?
I saw it. I would see a few of those magazines laying around. I think there was one called Sound Effect 2 or something. Sound Effects or Sound Effect. Anyway, yeah, I mean, people would always have these magazines here and there, and, you'd see them. And I wasn't a big, fanzine collector or anything. So I missed out on probably a lot of that stuff. But I'd read magazines at friends' houses. A lot of people had that stuff laying around their house.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably more meaningful to do it with people that you already know rather than just reading a bunch of capsule reviews of cassettes that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it was all, reviews are so subjective too, and, even if they gave it a bad review, sometimes I'd say, well, that sounds really interesting, and maybe I will get that because they say it sucks, who's this guy? Oh, he just gave this Flock of Seagulls record a good review. Fuck him,
Yeah.
He doesn't like this must be good.
Yeah, I mean, that, I don't know, I mean, I've asked some people, like, that, about that time, like 85, 86, it just seems like kind of a transition from when the whatever, maybe the word, maybe it's the wrong word, but like the infrastructure of like the early 80s kind of stuff was kind of losing, not falling apart. But
yeah, I mean, there's legality, and that's a good point, because if that's what you mean, things were becoming a little bit more corporatized, institutionalized, permits were harder to get, it was hard to do independent shows at venues, get a venue, rent a venue out, and do it on your own terms. You know, you always had to hire security, or, you know, there were more rules put in place, at least going by, you know, the Phoenix scene where I was watching it happen there, and I'm sure it was very similar in most cities, that, you know, knowing Tony so well, because Tony put on a huge amount of shows in that period, and he was really the guy that kept the Phoenix scene somewhat sort of unified in terms of shows, moving from venue to venue. Then he got his own venue. Then he got railroaded by the police and the local media and who knows, pulling the strings behind them out of that club by being set up by them. So I saw him go through all the different types of venues, you know, renting a VFW hall, working out of a bar, getting a closed down bar and reopening it as a punk club or this or that, and then moving on to a more respectable, having his own bar, having his own liquor license, having his own shows, and having anything from really experimental stuff to John Lee Hooker showing up on a Friday night, or Jorma Kaukonen, you know. And then that was the club, the Metro, that got railroaded by certain figures in the Phoenix scene that I think did not want that kind of a club to be operated by a guy like Tony and his co-owners. They were a little bit too, you know, I guess, outside the box. So it became harder to do really independent shows that had the same aura as the earlier 80s shows did. You know, where they were really sort of scenes out of you know, this kind of anarchistic lifestyle, to where there were really no rules. Everyone seemed to try to play together nice, but it became difficult after a while, after a scene became established. But there were nights that were so, you know, I guess, well behaved and well done, to where you felt this was some sort of idyllic community of like-minded people from all walks of life being able to exist, you know, for at least a brief amount of time. But I suppose this was similar to the 60s as well, before things changed there as well.
Yeah, from Summer of Love to Altamont or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
And that seems to be that seems to replay itself. Maybe not that extreme, but yeah.
Well, the police were always an issue, and the police always would clamp down on any kind of a independent music scene, and that was always a theme. And, you know, it was sort of accepted by everyone that this was going to be part of the problem, and you just hoped that, you know, you could get a show off without an incident or without getting raided, or, you know, it became a cat and mouse game at times with the club and the law and, you know, the neighbors. And, you know, I mean, it's just, I'm sure it was the same in almost every other place as it was in Phoenix, where I could witness it firsthand.
Yeah, it was anything to do with, again, I'm kind of looking at the tour dates. You all didn't really seem to tour outside of the local area, except for in Indonesia. You all were doing traveling, but in the late 80s, was that anything to do with external situation, or was that more?
Well, there was economical too. I mean, I think we did some shows in the Bay Area in the late 80s. I don't know, maybe there's a couple of times. I remember going up there in 85, 86, I think, or
yeah, that's the last one I see.
88, or I don't know, I don't remember. But I mean, there were times when we were working and we had jobs, or it was, you know, we didn't have the money to go, we didn't get any offers, we weren't looking to tour, so we didn't, you know, we could have probably put together tours, but we all had our own things going on. I mean, I think for the girls, it was never really an important thing to have to tour. We seemed to sort of react to the touring concept when we were asked to do something, and then we would build something around it maybe. But we had plenty of things going on our own. So, yeah, it was, and you know, it was difficult to find a good audience in those days, and that's why we always liked going to San Francisco, because we know that we could get a crowd, and it was even hard getting a crowd in LA for us. I think Chuck Dukowski and Saccharine Trust seemed to really kind of take us under their wing for a few shows there in the late 80s, I think, in LA. They would bring us out to play with SST bands. I think they might have been courting us for SST because I think we turned down SST once for a deal, but I can't remember the circumstances. But they were very cool and accepting, and we played a few shows out there. But yeah, it was tough to get a good audience, and to really get excited about trying to go out of our way to book a tour, knowing we're probably going to lose a lot of money.
Yeah. Was there a point where that changed? Because I'm looking, I keep looking through this timeline, like the what's the place called? And that had the two shows. Chameleon, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you look at that, and it's like it's 5 years late, 5-6 years later, but you've got Faxed Head, Zip Code Rapist.
Is that 1990, 92? When was that?
92, yeah.
Yeah, that was the Thinking Fellers tour. We started at the Chameleon, and then we went off to join the Thinking Fellers on all the other shows, and I think that's when we went around the country with them. So, but we were really getting a lot. I mean, in 90, we toured around the country as well, and that was our first foray into kind of booking our own tour and just doing it on our own. And it wasn't easy. I don't know that we made much of any money on that tour, but we got to play a lot of different places. We played with a lot of different groups, cover the entire country for the most part, parts of Canada. And it was a good experience for us, and we had a great time. And we played a lot of great shows on that tour.
Oh, yeah, okay. I'm looking at that is pretty extensive. Yeah, and there was, Chapel Hill, with Eugene Chadbourne.
Cat's Cradle, yeah, Chadbourne. We did a few shows with Chadbourne. Got a few numbers of some clubs from him to book. I think he was the one that gave us the numbers to the clubs in. I think there was the Tip Top Club and Hattie's in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. There was a club there. One in Alabama somewhere, Huntsville, Alabama. We played a couple of those types of shows. They were really maybe 30, 40 people, but they were really great audiences, and they were really, really great shows for us. Playing some of these bizarre places that we would never ever think of to do otherwise. And he recommended them, so we booked them, and they were cool.
With Carolina, I guess you would see them kind of in these snapshots or months or years apart, and then at some point they went from whatever they were like really early on, which I'd only heard about, to their kind of full-on stage show. And did you see that like evolve gradually?
Oh yeah. No, Carolina definitely evolved over the years. They got more, I guess, elaborate, especially with their, with Grux in his costumes. The black light show kept evolving. I mean, the more recent ones I'd seen in the last 10 years, maybe it was more like 10 years ago, was the most amazing one I've ever seen, which was in Seattle. And the music would always be evolving, I suppose, as well. I just like any group, I'm sure they had good nights and off nights when we witnessed them, but there's still nothing like it. Even the old Carolina, which was much more primitive in its approach, and they got much more sort of captivating from beginning to end as time went on. There's still nothing like it. You'll never see anything like a Carolina show. It's a one of a kind. It's its own universe, and you have to really admire the continuity of it, and to be able the persistence to keep it together for so long, and to continue to really push it when there's never been an effort to popularize the band from the inside. I mean, there's never been a way never been a true push from Grux or anyone in the band to make it anything of a network type of success. They keep the record prices at $5 for so long, and I don't know what they are now. I'm sure they're cheaper than every other record. And they don't really promote themselves in a way that would, that most bands would try to do. I mean, we were similar in that way, but they're, I think, as low profile as you could imagine.
Yeah. You see, so I mentioned something about the influence that you all had on them, and you said that it went both ways. I'm guessing it's not so much musical; it's just seeing that you could go beyond.
I mean, it always feels good when you see other groups out there pushing things to the limits. Especially when it comes to a more theatrical approach. And Carolina's a very theatrical performing group when they perform. So we always thought the same way. I mean, there's only 3 of us. Carolina usually had at least 5, sometimes more on stage, so they could really cover some ground. And with the costumes, the black lights, the music being as alien as it was or is, it's really sort of pushing everything. And it's something that you either gravitate towards it or you go, what the fuck is this, and you don't like it. So you have both schools of thought out there, but those that can understand it, at least in a way to where they keep coming back and who are curious, you're going to get rewarded, because there's just nothing that you're going to see like it. So I think just as comrades, in terms of pushing people's brains to go beyond the normal stimuli, is something that is inspiring. The more of us, the better. And I don't know about particular influences or whatever, but we'd always discuss music and we'd discuss different things. And just I think influencing, trading tapes with Grux over the years, and then CDRs and VHS tapes. I mean, he's always the winner. He's always sending me more than I could ever make for him. And there's a lot of things that I was turned on to by those tapes. I would imagine it's similar the other way, but I think Grux just had access to so much stuff, and he would share it. I heard so many things on those cassettes he would send. He sent 20 cassettes at a time, and I'd listen to them all. And then it became daunting after a while. Then he'd send me like 20 video cassettes that are 6 hours long, each. So I didn't have time. There was no time to process it all. I tried, but I've been turned on to a lot of stuff that he's sent me over the years, and I imagine something vice versa. I'm sure we offered him something, an inspiration.
So you all toured with Thinking Fellers at least once?
Once, yeah. It was that major tour in '92, and I think we did some local shows with them on occasion in Seattle and in the Bay Area. But it was mainly that tour. They were really popular when we toured with them. I mean, they were more popular than we were. They were bringing more people to the show than us, and they were the headliner every night. And they had a pretty good following, and I think it really increased maybe in the next few years. They kept touring, and I think they may have had a peak a few years later. But then I think they burnt out from touring so much. They toured Europe. They were, putting records out and touring in the 90s a lot. So it caught up with them. But I think that they were almost at the peak of their popularity on that tour. Not quite, but getting close. And, their music was extremely interesting in a more of a rock pop format, yet it didn't really feel that way. It felt more interesting than that. I don't know what you would call it. It was experimental pop, experimental rock, experimental pop, whatever. It was fascinating to see, and all 5 members were completely from a different universe. So you had this interesting collection of individuals that didn't look like they fit together. If you had all 5 of them standing on the street corner, it's like, oh, that's a band? That's weird. But it worked, and it worked really well for quite some time. But yeah, I mean, they weren't trying to go out of their way to please record companies, I don't think, to make big hits or anything. So there was nothing quite like a Thinking Feathers show, and you know, they really didn't get the credit that they deserved in terms of how they probably influenced so many people that, you know, aren't, you know, nobody's even aware.
There was a lot of, you know, role playing in or however you want to put it, theater, whether it's Faxed Head or Carolina or 3 Day Stubble, or, you know, this idea that you didn't have to take your first person identity on stage and sing about, you know, my emotions, first person. You know.
Oh, this is a given. You know, this is one of the most effective ways to actually make statements about society, make political statements, make statements about justice on this planet. Is to have a disguise or a mask or an alter personality, because then people seem to, or use humor. And these are very effective tools. They're more powerful than political discourse, because, you know, 0.00001% of the world's population is ever going to read, you know, into discourse and really, you know, get involved in that. But almost anyone can react and accept a performance. So, in other words, the performer, the musician, is a million miles ahead of any politician, any writer. You know, they have a way to be able to express in ways that writers can't relate to these. They're using the $10 million vocabulary that nobody speaks. So, you know, especially in academics and in, you know, journals of political discourse and all this kind of approach, you know, and now the media and the news and the way that things are articulated, you know, they're not done in a way, and that's by design. I mean, they don't want the average person to know what they're doing. They don't want people to understand what's really going on the planet, and they're not going to anyway, because the media will make sure to that. But, you know, it's a much more interesting, whether it's touchy or controversial or whatever, more interesting and effective approach if you can get an audience to use an alter ego, a costume, a disguise, a mask, because it isn't you, it's another entity. And that entity is expressing something that the person will give the benefit of the doubt to listen to, because they're sort of hypnotized by the other character, as opposed to just some guy up there spouting some statement like, you know, fuck the government or whatever they're going to say. So it's a powerful tool, and a lot of groups, you know, continue to use this. And back then it was a viable way of performing.
And here's to you, my malarial dream, asleep drenched in your cold sweat, as I count the 5 wide finger moons, drifting low in fog's ice breath, cooling, dripping, silent needles sip the blood I bore.